So the way
Okay.
we do this is just a completely casual conversation.
Yeah, yeah.
I'll do a little intro right now and a goodbye thing near the end that will sound kind of formal, but I'm going to edit this later. If you need to go look something up, look at your own scores, take a break, think about
I'm,
anything you want to say for any number of minutes, that's all
I'm
fine.
just a fidgety person in general, so I'm sure I'll pop up and down when I get excited about something. But
Okay, well that's awesome.
I'll probably be like, "Oh, wait, let me show you a thing," and then like it won't be necessary. But um, do we get to do ads like another podcast? Because I always wanted to do one of the ad things, like.
I
And thanks
mean,
for joining us today. You know what else I'm joining? I don't know what you would.
I don't know if I have enough listeners yet to do ads, but you're welcome to advertise for anything that you want to advertise for, even if it's like a product. You can do that if you think it would be
Well, I'd
funny.
like to advertise for the GoFundMe page I have not yet set up to help me pay my rent. Um, you know, I'm single. That's all. Sorry. Go ahead.
So I'm here with Brandon Becker, who's a composer living in California, I think.
Yep, I'm in Santa Clarita.
Oh,
So
awesome. Yeah. I met Brandon because he's another MFA student at Cal Arts in the composition program, and he's an excellent composer. Do you want to sort of describe what you do and what your artistic practice is all about in a very general way?
yeah, I am fascinated with. I, so the thing that interests me most is it's sort of two different prongs of it. One is that I have had a fair amount of unusually intense and experiences and a lot of trauma at a younger age than I expected. And for whatever reason, I have continued to come back to music and writing music because for some reason it helps me process that. I don't quite understand how or why. Um, and it's interesting to me that it kind of can do that. I think also on a social and community level, it has for as long as we've been recording history, and prior to that, served a fundamental central purpose within cultures and communities as a means by which to process trauma and um, create community and shared empathetic feeling. The fact that I don't know why it works like that and that it does it for me, and I every single time I'm like, it's not going to have that big of an impact on me. It's a Julius Eastman piece I've heard 1,000 times, and it does, is fascinating to me. The other thing is a lot of the music I've been making lately is very, very focused on what attention is, um, and the nature of focus and how that ties in very, very. It's inextricable from memory and expectation, because if you were to say so like memories are very malleable. People can convince you, gaslighting is a phenomenon that is based upon the premise that you can be convinced to have a memory you don't actually have, and that your brain will structure, at least in terms of the neural pathways, it will more or less create that memory. um, we also, like, it's very common to say, like, okay, the things you pay attention to are based upon not only your own brain chemistry but also your prior experience. If you pay, you see cars with windows broken like crazy after you had your car broken into, because now you're paying attention to it. If that is true, then it also follows that the things you remember that create your prior experience are themselves the things you pay attention to. um, and so how and what is salient within any experience with art can have a very, very profound effect on the mode of information processing that you do and your own awareness of that processing. It is one of the few things, literature too is for me, I've done this a lot, more than other things, where your brain is aware of the fact that you're feeling a thing that you don't know why you're feeling, and you're aware of the fact that it's not normal, and yet at the same time it is profound. I think the best artists and musicians in particular that I love and that have changed my life are artists who approach listening in a way that can be um, we are smart listeners, and you should give credit to your listeners, because if there is sincerity in it and you put your money where your mouth is, then someone else, ideally, if humans are worth anything, will also resonate with that. That capacity lets me work through attention and what it means. That was a very long way of saying I'm dealing a lot with silence. I'm dealing a lot with the difference between stratified sounds and in a concert setting, when there's like an old woman in front of you who coughs if you fidget too much, you know, because you're being loud, or you're unwrap a cough drop and you get this lady who goes like, shh. You're in this temporary suspended forced state of attention, for better or for worse. And because of that, I think it ups the ante on what you have to do for the performance. And it also creates a situation where you can teach people how to listen to things in the thing itself. Ligeti is a good composer who does, Lontano is a good piece that deals with like such massive amounts of density, it would be inscrutable if you started in the middle of it. But from the get-go, if you start at the beginning, it very gradually teaches you how to hear and listen inside of this web structure that is just obscenely dense. But if you listen from the beginning, by the time you get to that middle point, if you're wearing headphones, you'll be living inside of it in a way that would be cognitively not possible to drop into. Those are all the things I'm interested in musically.
Cool. I mean, those are very interesting topics. I was going to ask how they played out in your music, and I guess you answered that for attention. But in terms of processing trauma, how does this play out in the musical structure or extra musical structures that you're engaged with? And like, you can talk about some specific pieces too, if that would be helpful, because I'm sure
Yeah,
it's different piece
no,
to piece.
I'm still figuring it out. I'm not entirely sure how it plays in there, because I'm still not sure why. I'm in the process right now of doing a thing. So one of the albums that made an enormous impact on me, and I think is among my top 5 or 10 pieces of music that I look towards as something that is overly dedicated and goes beyond for the sake of that and that alone.
Mm-hmm.
And because of it does something really, really profound. Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar is, I think, as functional on a large, if you do an analytical breakdown of the piece, the whole album takes place in a day. It begins with a recorded sample, and so there's these skits going between it that are it's never clearly posited whether or not they're actual skits or reenactments or actual recordings. They're done as though they were on a tape recorder. And throughout the day, it is a like completely autobiographical, non-objective recounting of something that is very damaging, dark. Is best friend gets shot in the end and dies. But at the same time, he uses that as a vehicle by which to function within the genre. It fucking slaps. It is hip hop at the highest level, and undermine and critique the genre norms. I think Julius Eastman's music does the same thing. I think the best of David Lang does the same thing. Olga Newworth, any number of whatever, Rick Burkhart, Andrew McIntosh's music, Michael Pizarro's music. I think there is a function by which they allow you to, they do a thing where they're aware of themselves. The problem with that, when you get, the reason I mentioned Good Kid, Mad City is that it's easier to do, or it's easier to feel comfortable doing, if the trauma you are dealing with is not your own, or is parallel, and you become a storyteller. Which is not to minimize the, I said that like it was some flippant thing, but like if you're, storytelling is a very, very compelling, profound art form. We as within the like experimental new music world, I think have an aversion to putting ourselves in the line of fire, which is not to say that's bad. I think there are really incredible, profound things you can do by telling stories not from your own singular perspective. But at the same time, there becomes a thing when you say, all right, well, if I want to deal with a piece that's dealing with topics that mean a whole fuck ton to me and that have had massive influences on my life. For example, I've lost where I grew up in Tacoma, Washington, is a very blue collar town, and it has been decimated by heroin and meth. And I have watched friends like OD on heroin and turn blue and die. And yet still people protest needle exchange funding at the city level because they don't want to condone drug use, which is a good sentiment. It is coming from a good place. But the reality of it is when it is implemented, there in Boston, for example, there was a 70% drop in HIV transmission and about 3,000 less people died. So it's like, what would it take for your impulse that says, I don't want to condone drug use to be less important than if I were to say to someone, well, would you be willing to condone it and feel horrible about condoning it if it saved 3,000 people's lives? So who do you care about more, the principle or the human? Things like that. Also, for a long time, I have years and years of recordings from my phone that I used to take of me being in the old shit I used to get up to, the stupid shit. But then I realized, like, oh wait, I was there in all these recordings. Like, I could just describe it, but then it becomes you put your own self in the line of fire if you say, I also was shooting up heroin. You no longer have objectivity. It becomes massively more problematic. The likelihood that someone will shut down and not actually hear it as a story that they can feel by allegory what that person is going through. Mm-hmm. It's a lot easier to shut someone down when you do it first person perspective. It's the difference between I use hip hop as an example a lot just because that's like what I grew up listening to mostly. And also I think, like, at least in America today, in my personal opinion, that there's a lot of really shitty hip hop, but the stuff that's the good is some of the best art music going on in the country right now. Likewise with experimental music, I think there's a lot of shitty experimental music, and then the very best is some of the best stuff going on in the country right now. But there is a big switch that happens in mid 2000s between like the Dope Boys trend, where you end up with like people like Pusha T, where it is all about the damage and trauma of growing up and being around cocaine like crazy. I didn't grow up during the crack epidemic. I grew up during the meth epidemic. So it's a very different scenario. But that saying that and then going to someone who gets ridiculed crazy, like Lil Wayne, for example, which regardless of what you think of him, he is one of the first artists to sell what at that level in the 2000s whose singles were about him struggling with drug problems, like going through codeine withdrawals. And immediately you open yourself up to, like, yeah, he's just a fucking, like, you know, like codeine scissored out guy who's just like rambling. He's not really serious about rap. And then you're like, well, if he wasn't codeined out and you gave him the benefit of the doubt that he was doing that, whatever he was doing was done with intention, does that still apply? And finding a way to correctly do that and actually allow it to both be a processing of trauma, to avoid the pitfall of using dramatic or traumatizing subject matter to lend gravity to a piece that is otherwise irrelevant or unrelated. You know, I could title something like "For Hiroshima," and immediately I have weight, but also I'm like just a piece of shit because
Well, you know, the Threnody, that's how it was titled. I'm sure you know that when you
exactly. And the thing is it sells. But I think for dealing with it personally, it's easy to use a subject matter that is dark and very, very real for me personally, that would make it sound more heavy, that would give it more gravity, but that would not actually, you know, sincere, non-reductive and complicated, difficult manner deal with that actual subject matter. Come Out to Show Them, and I think a piece that does that. It is one of the few things where you have a sample of a black man's speech from the Harlem riots in a piece of music commissioned and made by a white man who was not there. or well, who was not the primary victim. And it actually turned out really well. And I think I'm still figuring out the processing of trauma part in concrete terms. That is something I've been working on for the last 4 years, is this particular piece, this like collection of recordings. And I think in the next 12 months or so, I'll actually have, for whether or not figured it out, I will have realized that finally, because it's been a shit ton of time. The other ones nevertheless seem to do that for me, even though tangibly I would be at a loss to describe how or why, and it would not sound relevant. It was very roundabout. Sorry.
No, it's okay. That was a great answer. The one that's going to be finished in the next 12 months or so, that's the one that utilizes your phone recordings.
Well, I don't. When I say piece, I just mean like thing, chunk of a thing that may be another thing later down and may spawn like 7 more things. No, it's not going to utilize my phone recordings. It's going to be me talking, and I've been making recordings. I see. I'm still trying to figure out how exactly to process it. I had a period where I'm atypical bipolar schizoaffective disorder. And I was sort of in denial about that for a while. After I graduated from my undergrad, I did extremely well academically and compositionally. It was also the reason for that was that it was the onset of early low-level mania, which meant I only had to sleep like 3 hours a night and I could work on things constantly. The thing that happens is that gets worse and worse and worse. And it very quickly transitions from like, I have superhuman composing powers to like, I am hallucinating. I see people, I hear people. I think I'm being followed. I can't write. I can't sleep for weeks. And I started to go insane, and I had a nervous breakdown, and my personality fractured and fragmented. And I had to like relearn to, I couldn't understand English syntax or grammar. I had to like relearn to read. And it was a very fucking bizarre thing that I'm still figuring out. But also alongside that, like that's all fits into the narrative of like the tortured artist thing pretty well. It's easy to play. I was also at the end of that started using meth. So that one, not as easy to play as tortured artists, because we don't like to think about agency. And honestly, ignoring the mania and not getting on a mood stabilizer or an antipsychotic medication was the stupider thing and the stupidest thing I've ever done. Once I finally, I literally, within 1 week after that breakdown, left Portland, where I'd lived for 6 years, and moved back up to Tacoma, where I grew up with my family, and got on lithium and started seeing a doctor, and it saved my life. That stupidness and that stubbornness to not realize that it would be probably pretty smart to just get treated for something the same way. Like if I had high blood pressure, yeah, I'd go fucking to the doctor and find the medication. Or like if I had fucking arterial fibrillation, and I would get on warfarin, I would take my meds.
I don't think
But
you're
if
the
you
only
have
one in the
mental
United
illness,
States. I don't think you're the only one in the United States who has some kind of fear of going
but
to
we
the
don't
doctor.
like, we don't like to blame that on someone. But if someone is using drugs, it becomes an acceptable thing to say, well, it was their own fault. The problem is there is a very, first of all, like dealing with that and confronting that head on is really interesting to me, because it's not that it's out of intentional or conscious ill will or bias, but you see it in the way we talk about language, or the way we use language. There is a less than human, so someone who is struggling with mental illness versus someone who's a crackhead. I mean, first of all, A, reason someone did crack in the beginning. B, extremely dehumanizing and demeaning way to define someone, as though their drug addiction is their definition of them as a person. C, if you've watched crack, there is a point at which people do not have the choice to stop. They do it. Likewise, the same thing happens with methamphetamine, and it has decimated the queer community in Tacoma, in particular. I've watched my friends turn into like White Walkers and zombies, and I don't fuck with that stuff anymore. But dealing with the dichotomy of tortured artist narrative that plays well and is romanticized, and doing some stupid shit and then realizing, what was that Mac Miller line? I did a little too much, now I see a little different. Or no, now I see a little different,
You
a
can
bit
look it
too
up
much,
if you
got
want.
stuck in oblivion, yeah.
Remember, I
It's
can
not
edit
even
this
the
shit.
greatest song, but it's got a very accurate, so the people our age, I mean, the people I know my age who are writing really, really good music, especially who have dealt with either mental illness or drug problems, because they go hand in hand, are, if you grew up in a community or in a city where there was a major, where the drug epidemic hit especially hard, and you really see the damage firsthand. People my age, it was the meth epidemic in the 90s. Because prior about 1991, it was not a, I mean, there's a whole long history to it, because I mean, it's only scheduled to, it's technically still prescribed for narcolepsy and ADHD medication, but the epidemic, it blew up like crazy. And I mean, I can walk down streets on Tacoma where I can point at houses of people who are either gone and dead, or there might as well be, they're skeletons. But then you also can, there's this thing where you can kind of, I don't know, for me at least, in music, when someone's dealing with it, particularly when they're dealing with actual language and lyrics, you can recognize it very, very immediately. I don't know, I'm losing my thread on this, because it's something I'm still working through and figuring it out. Partly because I think a lot of the, I don't know, I'm going to leave off on that thread, because as I'm looking this up, I'm realizing I'm getting involved in too many tabs. Because I've currently am working on 3 different pieces right now, and I have 7, 8 desktops open on my Mac, and I found my Zoom.
Oh, there we are.
But the point being is, so those are all things, and I've not said any of this stuff to anyone before, and now I'm like, oh wait, if I want to deal with it artistically, I should like probably be pretty like casually flippant about it, because it's not something that, there's this quote by Robin Williams. He's like, alcoholism and relapsing as an alcoholic is different than someone who drinks and is not an alcoholic. Imagine this, it's like, what did he say? He was like, after 10 years of, I'm going to paraphrase it because I would not be able to land the punchline well, but after, he was talking about in a stand-up set about 10 years of sobriety, and then deciding, well, one little of the travel thing's a whiskey. And then I think then the line was, next thing I knew, I woke up next to a sheep in a field, jingling like a fucking wind chime with little mini bottles of stuff. And then the phrase, it's like sleepwalking with activities. That's what really severe, in my case at least, mental illness felt like, to a much, much more intense extreme degree than any drug I've ever done in my life.
Santa Cruz, California, where I live,
Yeah.
heroin hit this town very hard. And
Yeah.
I've known people who aren't here anymore. So
Yeah. And if
maybe,
it weren't
maybe
so
not as
easy to
close
die.
as you, but
The thing is the one thing that I've shared with all these people, even in the worst, like I know like people who are rock bottom homeless, still trying to find like a bubble to like tweak a bit and need some clear, like still will fucking listen to a good album of music with you and sit down, to the extent that like I have sat with people who have been awake for weeks and are like shooting drugs I would never even touch. And whether I'm dead sober, or I mean, now I'm dead sober, I still have friends like that. Or in the past where I would, it was not something I took to that extreme with, but I would still be like, you got to check out this piece. It's called, okay, so the N word's in the title. It's this composer named Julius Eastman. It's long. So just sit with me for 20 minutes and let's listen. And you'll sit in dead silence together and listen to this entire incredibly dense, strange, abrasive, aggressive, painful piece that feels like a living panic attack, and still be able to like cry about it afterwards together. And that is unique to anyone willing to listen. but it is not unique to anyone who lives in a certain circumstance or a different circumstance in life, I think. Which is all to say that I'm not trying to write a music that is edgy or transgressive. It is simply to Dowland does some similar things in my mind. You're gonna have to edit this a lot. My brain's real scattered. Sorry.
It's okay. Even
Let's
if
bounce
it's
on to another subject.
it has a good logic, even if it's not a normal linear logic. So I don't think it'll be that bad.
It goes around circles. It's like if you drew the negative space around a thing in order to draw the thing instead of drawing the actual outline. I'm drawing the negative space, so you're going to get an image in there. It's going to be a stick figure, but I got to draw all the surrounding areas to make the stick figure show up.
Fair enough, fair enough. And on editing, of course, you can always let me know if anything that you feel like you said,
No, I trust
line
you.
it out. Yeah.
So I'm just still figuring it out. So
Cool.
I've talked with this about my composition teacher too. So it's more just been a like, oh, if I'm going to do this and compose, it has to be a thing that I'm not, you know, it's something that you would politely keep to yourself in most circumstances. But if I'm going to actually go, oh, well, if I'm actually going to like do this and put my money where my mouth is compositionally, it has to be transitioned to a subject matter in and of itself, rather than just as a thing that would be more appropriately kept to yourself, because to say it directly would be essentially the shock value of it is too high. It's difficult for anything to be communicated other than like, oh my God, which is not a good thing. So I'm mentioning it for the reasons of it becoming me having committed to making it compositionally viable. Yeah.
Very cool. Would you like to maybe talk about some specific pieces then? You sent me a couple that you wanted to talk about in particular beforehand.
How does this work? So like, does it get played, or do people, how's the format work for when you're editing and what?
Usually,
like, what do you want me to?
We can do the show however you want, but the formula I usually go by is it depends on how much music you have to put on the show and how much interesting things we talked about, which was so far everything's been interesting. So it would be more talking and less music, but usually I just put the songs in the middle of the conversation at a point that makes sense. Like after usually in the middle of us talking about a piece, I'll find a good breaking point and put the piece there, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So people get an introduction to what the piece is. They listen to the piece, and then they can hear us talk about the piece in a bit more detail afterwards.
All right. So there's two pieces.
All format things can change, and I'm totally flexible.
I'm going to condense myself. So that was those subjects were the hardest things for me to say succinctly, just because I'm still very in depth of working out the nitty gritty on it. Two recent pieces. One of them is called Repetition Study 2. It's the second of the series I've been doing that deals with sort of a commitment to very, very strict usage of silence and the use of fixed materials in strict repetition as a way of modulating how you hear them in live performance. This is something that doesn't work as well on recording, but in live performance, there's a point at which you can hear, if you hear something 4 times repeated, you won't have to count in order to know it's been 4 times. There's a break at about 7. The phrase for it in visual arts usually is done with it's chunking. Usually the example they do in psychology is dots. So if you look at a group of small black dots, 3 of them, you look at it, you say 3. You don't have to go 1, 2, 3. Likewise, up till about 6. At 7, your brain starts actually having to count. And then upwards of that, past about 9, you can't do it by auto recognition. You have to actually count them. Likewise with memory of repetition in music and sound. It's a little bit different. Our auditory recognition is shorter. And so it is shorter. It also has to deal with rhythm and metric accents. But the point being, if you push it to the point where, how long do I have to keep repeating it to the point that you won't have known how long it's or how many times it's repeated unless you were lucky enough to start counting from the beginning. You can know 4 times if I say 11 times, unless you remember to start at 1 and count each one, you'll be a little bit vague on how many times it's happened. If that material doesn't develop, then it becomes an object you can look at. Likewise, if it's complex enough, for example, if you exerted one measure, one chunk of Fernie Howe, and just had that player repeat it 30 times, you start finding things inside Fernie Howe that are insane and weird. And also that musician will never in their entire life be able to play it exactly perfect each repetition. So you start getting artifact and error that becomes very, very essential. And as a listener, even if you're a non-trained musician, you become aware of the artifact and error and the exertion of the performer. In order to make that work, you essentially have to have the music material that follow, or in my opinion, if there is then development and transition, the thing you listen to is how things change. If you want them to literally listen to the object, or if I want to listen to the object, I've realized I can just fucking put 10 seconds of silence before it and after it, before the next object comes. And then you are able to parse them as individual segments rather than a transition or development of a motive or theme, or whatever you want to call it, cell. Some of this comes from James Tenney's idea of like Klang as a, well, I'm not going to get into that part of it, but so
if you want, but
no, that's a whole nother wormhole. But so the repetition study 2, the subtitle is Music as a Means of Processing Trauma. I wrote for the Yarn Wire Summer Composition Institute 2 years ago. So it was Russell playing it on one of the percussion setups. So it's 2 percussionists, 2 pianists, for those of you who, well, so for those of you listening who aren't familiar with the Yarn Wire, go listen to them immediately because they're utterly amazing. They're also just the nicest, most fun, cool people, and are very comfortable making adjustments on the fly, partly because they're incredibly good. Like there's no, protective layer of like, whoa, let's try that again tomorrow. Can we rework that? It's a, yeah, you want to like this? Let's give it a shot. And then the piece worked really well, I think. And it was fascinating working with them because I set myself this goal of saying, so the way I would work is I would generate as much material for about 2 weeks. I would write every idea, every possible thing I could come up with. Then I would take all of those, I would cut them out. I usually handwrite. And then I would sort them into like materials or similar gestures. Anytime I had written an idea that was, so like a flared crescendo starting from niente that ends on a sharp cut at sforzando with an abrupt stop on the string, or whatever it happens to be, or tongue ram at the flute that ends jet whistle. I would sort like gestures, like materials into stacks, and essentially say, all right, well, these are versions of a concept or of a abstract thing. What is the best version of this abstract thing if I only wanted to use one? Let me combine them all, or figure out how and what is good in each of them. And then once I've done that, condense it down to essentially 7 measures. Measures, 7 chunks. And the full score for it is, I think, 4 pages. I generated something like 60 pages of material in those first 2 weeks. So it was a very, very long, not even long, it was a very intense process of going like, not that, not that, not that, not ha. And then just said repeat 30 times. And then absolute silence, do not move to prepare for the next segment. Freeze in place for 15 seconds and turn to the next segment. There are 7 of those. It, I think, creates a certain repetition, lets me hear things more, and I very rarely can process it all in the first pass, especially if it's very complex new music. I love pure Boulez, but there's some very dense Boulez pieces that at the end of it, you're like, whoa, what the hell just happened? Which is fantastic. But you can also like open up that file in Logic and just loop a chunk of it that's really beautiful to you and be like, oh shit, wait. Oh man, I can hear what's happening. Wow. Oh, and then all of a sudden it becomes comprehensible. So that's part of, I mean, that parallels the trauma thing to some extent because it's a thing that is inscrutable and incomprehensible, but that nevertheless has a profound impression, you know, like whether it's like, I just can't even break it down into parts. I just can't make sense of it. Versus looking at it and saying, all right, well, if we look at this one part and we set it there and we look at it from different angles, we repeat looking at it, can we find bits in it that make it more comprehensible and coherent? So that's that piece. It works especially well live because when they're doing the repetitions, it's a lot of double bowing. I'm using oil filter wrenches. So the other thread is that I'm really fascinated with deconstructing spectrally using analyses of acoustical sounds and breaking them down into the psychoacoustical phenomena and then the physical partials of that. So like if you want to do crotales, you only have equal tempered 12-tone sets. Oil filter wrenches, should you be someone who changes your oil frequently, you know, what we got here? Sound of clanging. You know, you open that. If you buy a large set of them, they come in assorted sizes. They're made of aluminum, which is what's important. Aluminum is incredibly resonant. About the same volume as crotales. Can be mounted on. I'm dropping it. Can be mounted on a crotale stand, and is microtonal. So you can do things like it's harder when I'm holding them. So
You might want to, if you want to include the sound, you might want to turn on your original sound.
Yeah, I don't include the sound, mostly just
Okay.
for the sake of maintaining the thread.
Yeah.
But so that those are used in that piece, and so there's a lot of double bowing between that and crotales, and so they start to percussionists start to kind of look like little wind-up dolls.
Hmm.
And likewise, the other piece is this one that I did sort of as a proof of concept for six-bowed music stands, because the standard Manhasset music stand we see and seen all our lives growing up from like band in elementary school are also aluminum. And they have a low B fundamental, and you can, by altering bow pressure, speed, angle, and using a very light dampening of certain nodes with your other hand, you can play multiphonics and chords and melodies. It's sort of the way, if you're very sol ponticello and you are playing kind of overpressure, like Sarajevo pieces, kind of she'll make use of that, where you kind of get this sound as though the string player is actually pulling out partials. You can sort of take a low note and then get all of the upper harmonics, if you, especially when there's a lot of vibrato. I'm thinking of this performance that Ashley Walters did of this Sarajevo piece I saw years ago, where at one point I thought she was like, I thought the score must say something crazy like jump up to upper partials and do that, and it was just a low note with wild vibrato overpressure on the bridge. But that's what happens is by doing that, you, without actually moving things, you can through bow pressure choose partials more or less. It's even more prominent when you're dealing with something like aluminum and it's on a square plane, because it's such a rich multiphonic resonant piece of material that is inherently chordal. We hear them as timbral phenomenon until you put them in a context of tonality or of intervallic context or harmonic context, whether through traditional harmony or through what I'm dealing with right now, which is sax multiphonics and using a lot of just intonation with organ stuff. And then once you do that, your ear can't ever quite hear them again as just timbre or noise, because you become aware that there's a chord in it. And now, unless you like walked away for 24 hours and came back, maybe once your ear had forgotten that moment prior to that, your ear's gonna hear it as the chord. and being able to take those apart using a lot of computer software and other things, so I can like look at what's inside of it just as a sequence of amplitudes and frequencies, um, a dictionary essentially, or an array if I'm implying in super collider, lets me work with things inside of them instead of having to, lets me get inside the thing and then make it pretty and beautiful the way it is for me, for other people, I think.
Can I ask you about the title of this piece? It's
Yeah.
called The Awakened, Lips Parted, The Hope, The New Ships.
It's a William Gaddis quote, actually. I don't know if you've read anything by William. Have you read any William Gaddis?
I don't think I have. Can you tell me about William Gaddis and about this quote?
Yeah, I would. Honestly, the quote is just that it was beautiful to me, um, which is pretty poor reason to steal. I think I was reading William Gaddis at the time and I couldn't come up with the title, and I was like, oh, that kind of fucking works real well for some reason. God, he's good with language. You should, if you like kind of the postmodernist Americans, the authors that um, like Thomas Pynchon or Toni Morrison to an extent. William Gaddis was sort of in that thread. The Recognitions came out. I think he wrote it in like the 50s actually, so it was a little bit prior to some of the counterculture movements that Thomas Pynchon was so wrapped up in. But his use of language is similarly like A, just fucking pain in the ass to read, way too dense. B, just excruciatingly gorgeous. Like the 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 way things taste and sound in your mouth as you're working over syllables and alliterations and slight, something that kind of bounces from the tip of the tongue as you're saying it, and has this language becomes not just a communication of content, but as a sort of vocal kind of. I mean, like even if you didn't speak English, it would be beautiful to read it. My uh, Dostoevsky's similar. I don't read Russian, but like I can pronounce it if I like work my butt off, and it's absolutely beautiful linguistically in the syllables of it. Um, and that is what interested me about that quote, is that the way the punctuation was, um, the ordering of it, it's more or less clear what it's trying to say. But there's a lot easier ways that would say that, you know. But the arrangement of it and the way the words create a certain rhythm to them, I found very, very compelling and interesting. I don't know why, but I had a little underlined thing of that phrase in the middle of, I think it's in the Recognitions. It's like an enormous book. I don't know why I was even reading it at the time, but I had that underlined over like crazy, and then when I was flipping through it, kind of looked for stuff, I found that, and I was like, ah, that's I like that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It's a nice title. And this is I think I don't know if you remember this, but this is the first piece I listened to of yours, and it's very attractive. The sound of these bowed stands. What was the process of composing this piece? Did you compose it on the computer in Super Collider or something, breaking apart the spectrums, or was there more of a direct interaction with the music stands themselves?
Oh, it was very. I had to learn to play them, and I have to teach them to anyone to play them. I spent a long time just practicing and learning. So the thing is when you deal with multiphonics on a plane, the same way if you're dealing with a wind instrument or a string instrument, there is a finite number, and they are reproducible consistently. It's not just that you can bow it and you get a spectrum. It's that there are. So what I'm doing now, the research I've been doing for the last like 2 years now, and what I've been working on last semester and I'm finishing in the process of now, the thing that made me lose track of time completely today, is doing a lot of analytical work using harmonic ratios and just intonation actually to describe the interior workings of saxophone multiphonics. The thing I have found out, which is crazy, is that there is a very, very, very simple mathematical pattern that applies to every single one of them. And it is that there's an initial interval and then a sequence by which, if you take the denominator and you add it to the numerator, you will get the next partial. And likewise, add that same denominator to the new numerator, you get the next partial. That is the structure that acoustically, because I believe, I don't know this for a fact, but I mean, if you're splitting the air column inside of a saxophone, and there are only certain relationships between vibrating columns of air that will allow them to be stable under normal human earth circumstances without them just collapsing and falling apart and squeaking. Likewise, all multiphonics are like that. All eight's the reason the overtone series is, like you can't just arbitrarily stack things and call it an overtone series. There's a very, very specific mathematical description of it, which is always true because that's mathematics. I started doing that, and when I realized playing the music stands that, oh, there are things I'm getting consistently, and if I practiced hard enough at the exact feel of it with the bow, I could land them every time. And then once I got a couple of those, I could say, oh, well, I can do like a full-on Wagner melody here with a chord. And so I actually, in order to deconstruct and analyze them, what I would do is I would record segments. So I had condensed down all the possible options that I could create, recorded little cross sections of them, and then analyzed them in Spear, which breaks them down into the partials, and then exported Spear actually as a single cross-section text file with only containing the partial and the partial as a frequency and the amplitude. So it was essentially the most simple numerical description, and you only need about 8 notes maximum in order to completely recreate the entire timbre of a bowed music stand. Because when they link up like that, all of the difference tones actually link up and ghost and match one of the other pitches. And then you get that grinding sound or that buzzing that you get in so many multiphonics is actually a difference tone that falls below your audible perception. So if there's a kind of multiphonic, usually it's because there's a difference tone at about 12 hertz between two of the upper pitches, and that is now the rate. So once I did that, it let me go back to the things I'd already figured out and say, okay, well, now that I know all of the things that make this work, instead of just that it does work, what else could I do with it? It's sort of like why you learn music theory. Like we can all, with our ear, figure out that 1-4-5 makes sense. And our ear will probably naturally figure that out, that there is tension and release, that 5 does create motion to 1 when it's in the context of tonal harmony. If you actually want to compose something interesting with it, it really helps to know why that is, so that you can realize that, like, oh, I don't need all these things to do this. I could move this one up here. Oh shit, wait, a transposition. Well, what if I move this one by a flat? Oh, and then all of a sudden you get into like WC or Wagner, and you start getting into this extended chromaticism, which you can figure out mentally because you know why your ear does likes the thing it likes, because you have been taught and have analyzed it to see the inner mechanisms. So that piece was essentially like I learned to play them first and then figured out why they worked the way they did, why certain ones I couldn't start from the upper pitch, I could only start from the lower pitch. All of those things. And then once I'd done that, I said, okay, well, now I know what my sound is in my ear, and I know what I can do with it. And I know what I can't do with it. Like there are multiphonics in that music stand piece that if I don't hit them at forte, they won't happen. If I hit them at piano, it will not sound, because the overtone series does not reinforce it accurately enough to make it speak initially. There's no physical way to gradually swell into them. They don't exist in that context. And you can know that by analyzing it and then say, like, if I'm writing a piece of music or counterpoint, I would go, oh, well, I can't approach the same way you wouldn't tell a singer to like pick their top of the range B flat soprano like out of thin air. You would give them some sort of lead up to it, or you would know that if you're asking them to pick that out, what they're having to do. So that was the process. I never really, I used Super Collider honestly primarily for analysis more than I do actually any live computer music.
Very cool. So I don't know if you meant to imply this, but were you saying that the structure of this piece is fundamentally sort of a tonal structure where you're using the harmonic series to create like sort of extended tonal relationships, sort of going beyond very far beyond Debussy, obviously, but continuing
Not
through the
even,
spectralists.
it's
But you don't think of it that
earlier
way.
than Debussy. Going back from that,
Yeah.
it's counterpoint.
Okay. You think of
It
it
functions
contrapuntally.
harmonically as counterpoint in the way that you get like early Purcell, or even earlier than that when you start talking about Palace, you get weird things like split thirds happen.
Hmm.
Because counterpuntally, by the rules of it, you'll end up with like a C major with an E flat in it, oftentimes in Purcell, because they're functionally writing it as it's sort of like privileging voice leading always over. I never understood when some people were like, well, counterpoint is linear and harmony is vertical or like horizontal. And I was always like, yeah, but no, I mean, like it's vertical and lit. Until I was like, oh shit, wait, I see what you're saying. Like you can voice lead weird things. And if you're not dealing with a larger harmonic context that has been established as having certain rules, your ear will be just as fine with them.
Hmm.
The other thing, Shostakovich is really good at that. His counterpoint will do weird chromatic things, but they're not weird chromatic things in some extended tonality the way like Wagner is. They're just the voice leading works. And so it is tonal in this in a counterpoint was one of the first things I loved when I was started writing music, particularly like William Byrd. Um, and so it is counterpuntally it is harmonic insofar as like everything is harmonic that is a multiphonic because it would not in order for a multiphonic to exist it has to be equal ratios, um, because that's the only way the string or air column or plane can actually vibrate in two independent parts without them canceling each other out.
Hmm.
Um, Likewise, the overtone series is harmonic by necessity because unless you have whole ratio numbers, they won't create the sense of a single pitch. Um, so in that sense, it is not tonal though in the way like it would not make sense to analyze it using Roman numerals. You wouldn't get anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, you've shown me the score, so I know that. But you could have extended sense. I was wondering if
I
it
mean, it
was
is definitely
tonal.
tonal though.
Yeah, I wonder if it was the tonal in sense that you have like dominant functions and like
Yeah,
maybe dominant areas of the spectrum. You're treating the spectrum functionally, or if you were treating it like you were saying more linear, like linear voice leading orientation. But obviously, in every piece of music, both of those things are at a play to some extent, or can be seen, even if it's
I think they're
not.
always at play. Yeah,
Yeah.
or in my like for my own philosophy and approach to it is that like they are always there. Sometimes they are intentionally thwarted or subverted or ignored, but they are never not a variable. There is no such
Right.
thing as not having harmony,
Yeah,
in my
I
opinion,
I
unless you
think
have
I agree.
mono monophony. Monophony.
Yeah.
Where's the syllabic stress going there?
Yeah, I mean,
Monophony.
as soon as you have a noisy sound, that sort of is harmony, also too. But this
If
isn't.
anything
I mean,
comes
it's
after
very
it,
pitchy, so it's not as
it is very
noisy as
pitchy.
you
It is
think.
very very pitchy. Yeah.
Um,
First, Claude Vivier was a big influence on a lot of what I did. Not in that piece, but in as like kind of a counter polar opposite to it, using these sort of single lines
hmm.
that you think like Lonely Child. It's essentially there's only one line, and everything grows out of that. That is, I think. I mean, I think there is a monophonic line is Wolfgang would say things about that that are he would not agree with me. I feel like on a very particular point about that reason we're talking about intervals, but that's a whole other thing. Sorry, what were you saying?
Oh,
It's
we
been
were
a
just having a
long,
free
long
form
day. I've been up
discussion.
since
So
4 a.m. I woke up super early to work on this piece because I wanted to get a certain chunk done to be on track. So I've been up since 4, and I'm like, just
what's the piece? Can you tell me what the piece you're working on right now? Like, what's the instrumentation and what are you doing in the piece?
two alto saxophones, whole bunch of sine waves. Um, I'm an organist by my primary instrument as an undergraduate. I was composition and organ were the two things I studied. And there's a very different way of approaching um, norms of instrumentation and color and how improvisation factors into those as an organist, just because the tradition is essentially as like a church worker. Like you have to know your hymn, and if someone's carrying something too slow walking down the aisle and you end it before that, you can't just like stop playing and be like, ah, my hymn's done, and they're still walking. You on the fly, what you learn to do is be like, and now there's another phrase that is just like that one. Here's the antecedent. Is he close enough? Da, 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 da. All right, cool. We timed that well. But you're really just like freeballing the whole last part of it. And so it is, the instrumentation is for sine waves insofar as um, it's taking advantage of a lot of beatings to create um, uh, it's hard. I'm not sure how to describe it linguistically. So like the instrumentation is post-pandemic, two saxophones, me on electronics, or if someone else wants to do that and has like a theremin, I'd be like, oh, word, yeah, let's transcribe this for theremin. Let's go for that. I could also play it probably as an organ. I have a setup that I've worked out where it's sort of a one thing I want a theremin, but sine waves. And then there's also some sort of open instrumentation stuff that may change as it gets fixed down. There's sometimes when I'm writing a piece for like an ensemble, it's always starts from like the instruments and the instrumentation. This one has sort of been more like, here's the here's everything that is essential for the piece structurally, harmonically, everything else, and it has to have two saxophones, and these things have to be sine waves because you can't have the overtone spectrum interfering with any of the upper partials. But it could easily be done with a very, very well or effectively muted clarinet, for example. Someone was able to mute it enough to kind of high pass shave off some of those things and then use some very subtle glissandos. That would be dope. But yeah, so that's where it's at right now. I've kind of come to the decision it's not going to work as a streaming piece because it doesn't really work unless you're in a room with it, because the way the things interact with the beating, unless there's something for it to ring off of, and unless the room has acoustical um, sort of acoustical what's the word I'm looking for, profile, like you think of Alvin Lucier and like I'm sitting in a room. Without that, it doesn't ring correctly. Um, Sort of like you don't really hear difference tones the way you hear them if you're playing the actual violin doing it because you're so close. There are ways to like make things like that and weird acoustical phenomenon, or um, really just like, you know, aural what is that for, visual optical illusions for your ear, aural illusions. You can make those things happen without having to put someone with your fucking viola. Um, Carefully if it's in the same room and you're in the room with them. I also don't think it would work in a large. I don't. I mean, it might. I don't know if it would happen correctly.
You might need to amplify, right, in a larger room.
Well, but if you did that, you would need the sound sources to all be located where the musicians themselves are, and not to be. It would never.
Never be the
You
same.
wouldn't hear the things that are supposed to be heard if it was done through a PA system.
Mm-hmm.
Because directionally, I was actually talking to Ulrich about this a little bit, and he was saying the best thing, what his default always requirement in his scores is that to be amplified, you need two front and then two back speakers in the corners of the room behind, so that instead of having just a frontal stereo image, you're essentially inverting it and doing a full room, which I had not actually thought of before. But it makes sense that that would actually allow you to amplify something where the musicians are locationally fixed, and yet you want to amplify it in a way that's going to kind of just bring up the room, which usually you just do with a PA machine. You just do it with a PA if you were like doing sound for a band. But I think that might work. So I'm not sure yet on that. But on streaming, I think it would have to be electronic for it to work. Like people who do ASMR or like binaural beat things, I have a lot of respect for. Like, or I'm just fascinated by it as a headphone native sound art form, um, particularly binaural beats, which don't work without isolated headphones, unless each ear can't hear the other one. Um, and likewise, I don't think there would be a way to make it work unless I was actually taking all of those things into consideration if the person listening to it was going to be listening on the other side of a stream with headphones. So for that reason, I've decided to not. I was gonna try and do a stream concert of it in like a month.
Yeah.
And I decided, I realized like it's not gonna really come off great.
Well, that's all right. Things are looking to get better quicker than we expected. So hopefully in the fall we'll be on campus and
I'm
you can
gonna
do
hug
that.
you. I've never even seen you. I'm gonna literally just I'm gonna do that twice, and then I'm gonna realize it's an invasion of personal space. So those first two.
No, you can hug me once we see each other. You're
The
welcome to hug me.
isolation is killing me, man.
Same. It's so hard.
It's so
And
fucking hard.
there's just so many things about music which depend on being in the same room as people. The
Yeah.
acoustics, the rhythm, is totally different. Playing with click tracks is just
Have you found your social skills have like dropped off?
I'm already have already I've always
I
had
mean,
bad social skills. So
fair enough. Me too. I feel like one of those dogs that doesn't get taken for walks very frequently, and then the owner finally does, and it's just like it sees another dog, and it just is like, "Hey, how's it going, man? Let's hang out." And the other dog's like, "Whoa, bro." I feel like that. Like as soon as I go outside and have a
same.
conversation, I'm like, "Oh, I don't know how to do this anymore. I'm really sorry. I have to reacclimate."
Yeah,
Um,
that's completely relatable. I think same here.
Currently, my talking patterns and my inability to naturally have a reasonable cadence for conversational etiquette is definitely it's gonna take me a couple of weeks of interaction once this pandemic's up to get that.
No, you have a great cadence. I don't think you need to worry about that. It's nice hearing people's different idiosyncratic cadences. It's one of the coolest things about talking to a bunch of people.
Yeah, but I
So,
listen more and ask a lot more questions when I'm not isolated as much.
well, it's such a weird social experience, being in Zoom meetings with people in particular, right? Like
Yeah.
you're with them, but you're also alone. So, especially while you're talking, it feels more like you're alone, I feel, than when you're listening. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's this thing where like in person we're always there's all these measures of the way you measure attention in psychological clinical studies. There's different metrics. One of them is task switching versus active versus passive attention, all these things. And it's it's normal to have a conversation, and I might be like talking to you while I'm making you a cup of coffee and doing these things. On a Zoom meeting, that is weird, and
Mhm.
it's very very uncomfortable to try and have a conversation with something while they're multitasking. And I feel that way with other people just as like an innate thing. It's not that it bothers me. It's that like my gut reaction is to think they're not listening, which is weird because in person, it wouldn't cross my mind. I'd be like, yeah, we're talking and they're making coffee. Of course, people, that's what's normal. It'd be weird if every time someone talked to you, you paused, froze, and stared at them.
Yeah.
But because of that, there's this weird dynamic of like there's no uh, ring to the conversation back and forth in Zoom meetings. There's not a sort of playfulness to where even if it's a deep conversation, there's a certain at
Yeah.
playness in person that I miss so much.
I agree. And with this, even the small delay of Zoom, it's harder to like have an interruption back and forth, natural flow between two people. You really have to like wait to let people finish. Then the whole conversation feels much more stilted, which I've noticed a lot interviewing people.
Yeah, or the opposite problem where it's like, oh, let's try and make it dynamic. Let's just if you have a question, just jump in.
Yeah.
Then everyone jumps in and everyone's constantly like, oh, I jumped in at the wrong point, sorry. And then someone else jumps in and they're like, oh fuck, sorry, my bad, my bad. I really didn't mean to cut you off. And then I'll do it and I'm like, oh, I promise I'm not an asshole. I misgauged the amount of pause.
Yeah. Totally relatable.
I don't know though, man. I don't even know what I'm doing, to be perfectly honest. I this is life's a trip. But sound and music like literally just like got me out of a psych ward, and like it shit matters to me a lot, and I still seems just ludicrous that it does. Like it just for all practical purposes makes no sense. Um, but at the same time, like I'll think that, and then I'll listen to a piece of music with headphones on, and I'll be like, "Oh yeah, I listened to a Little Magical Passion," and I'm like crying. Why? How? I
Oh,
knew that would happen.
the
It's
text painting.
happened before, um, and yet
Of course you're crying
before,
it that
but
one.
until you do it, you don't remember that it could do that like that.
Yeah.
You know, in the abstract, that that's what music does. It makes you, and then you hear it, and you're like, oh shit, it really does make you like, whoa. And then immediately afterwards, you would be like, a week later, at least I would be like at a loss to ascribe to that any sort of profound power until I listened to it again, and then I'd be like, Jesus, why does it do that? It's so incredible, and it's a certain, there's a gnosis to it, the Gnosis, sort of innate. I don't know. Yeah, there's more thoughts on that. I gotta. This is more. This is less linear and concise than even I would normally be. I apologize.
No, it's nothing to apologize for.
I mean, I'm always
Tot-
a little bit scattered and around the loop, but this is particularly a leggy day.
Nothing to apologize for. I think you haven't been as scattered as it feels like you are, maybe to yourself. And everyone is scattered,
That's fair.
and everyone is more scattered now that we're isolated. But I totally relate to that. Art music is a special artwork of the present moment. It's sort of what I was hearing in what you're saying, and I totally relate to
That's
that.
a very good way of saying it. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. See, there's always I'll spend like 30 minutes trying to figure out a thing, and then there's like such a beautiful kernel. Thank you.
That's
Yes,
what you were saying. I mean, at least that's what I heard.
and that's the thing. That's where it ties back into attention too. Is or like people like to use the word mindfulness now. It's kind of like in vogue, which is not. I don't mean that in a derogatory way either. But like there is a paying attention to something implies existing in a moment and not reflexively acting. Um, which is what is shared in a really interesting. I mean, hyperfocus is another weird phenomenon that happens sometimes. Um, like I take medication for ADHD, and my experience has been that if the dosage is too high, it is as ineffective as if the dosage is too low. Sort of a sweet spot. Because when you get hyperfocused, it's actually a clinical symptom. It's got in the DSM. Um, what it essentially is it's you're uh, stuck in the moment. It's like if every moment you were in, but because of that, you're not aware of the moment you were just in and its connection to the current moment. So you're like all in, all in, all in, but not passively aware of the fact that while you were all in here and you started getting all in here, you were waiting for something to download here because you're
Yeah.
constantly hyper focused in the moment, which is weird too because it complicates in a I think a delightful way the idea of being. I apologize. Yeah, sorry, I'm real scattered. That was
No
very.
problem. This has been an incredible conversation, Brandon, and thank you for being so open to being honest, about your life and how your artistic practice relates to your struggles. I really appreciate that level of vulnerability, but also willing to connect it to a conceptual place as well as being vulnerable about the intimate, aspect of your artwork. So it's been fascinating for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about that we haven't covered? Because this is sort of for you, and I want it to be like a platform where you could talk about anything that you think would be valuable too.
God, fuck if I know. I don't know. What's up with you?